If you're into true crime that doesn't just shock you, but changes the way the world works, hit subscribe right now. Drop a comment with the name you think is the most feared behind bars. And brace yourself, because tonight's story isn't about a prison. It's about the moment a prison system decided it could never trust itself again. The morning air over southern Illinois sits heavy and gray, the kind that makes concrete look even colder. Inside USP Marion, time doesn't move like it does on the outside. It breaks into routines, keys, counts, doors, echoes, until the entire day becomes one long hallway. Men live by the smallest sounds, a distant latch, a boot scuff, a voice that doesn't need to shout to be understood. On October 22, 1983, that routine fractures. It doesn't begin with a riot. It begins with movement, controlled, ordinary, almost boring. A few minutes of human traffic in a building designed to make human traffic impossible. A door opens where it always opens. A corridor becomes a corridor again, briefly. And in that narrow window, a decision gets made that will outlive everyone inside the walls. An inmate steps into the moment like it's been rehearsed 1,000 times in silence. His name is Thomas Silverstein, and the prison already treats him like an emergency that learned how to breathe. He is not here to bargain. He is not here to be heard. He is here because the system has no room left to punish a man who is already buried alive in sentences. The killing happens fast, too fast for meaning, too fast for regret. A correctional officer, Merle Clutts, is gone. The corridor that held routine a minute ago now holds something else entirely. The knowledge that the most secure federal prison in America can still be reached, still be broken. And then, as if the first shock isn't enough, the day continues. Only hours later, another inmate, Clayton Fountain, does the unthinkable again. Another officer, Robert Hoffmann, is killed. 2 deaths in the same institution, separated by time, but linked by message. It isn't just violence, it's a statement. Your rules don't matter to people with nothing left to lose. The prison doesn't respond with a search for explanations. It responds with architecture. Marion's world begins to shrink in real time. Doors stop opening, movement schedules collapse. What used to be temporary restrictions harden into policy. The prison shifts into something that isn't a prison anymore, not in the traditional sense. It becomes a lockdown machine, a place where men are kept in their cells for nearly all hours, where the concept of yard becomes a memory, where control isn't enforced in moments, but embedded into the day itself. No speeches are made to the men living it. There's no dramatic announcement, just the quiet, relentless transformation of ordinary confinement into something colder, the control unit idea. The belief that a tiny number of inmates are so uncontrollable that the only solution is to build a life where control is absolute. The shift is visible in the smallest details. Meals arrive as slots opening and closing. Conversations become fragments passed through vents, shouted through steel, smuggled through timing. The air feels different when human movement is removed from a building. Silence becomes a kind of pressure. In a place like Marion, you can measure policy not by what's written, but by what you stop hearing and what you stop seeing. The logic behind the change is simple and terrifying. If the prison can be pierced twice in one day, then every day is vulnerable. Administrators don't need to say it out loud. The building says it for them. The punishment for the entire population becomes a new normal, and the consequences ripple outward, beyond Marion, beyond Illinois, toward an American prison future that will be defined by solitary confinement, segregation, and the concept of a facility built to hold people the system has labeled unmanageable. But Marion isn't the only place where a single act forces a system to reshape itself. 2 years earlier, and nearly 1,000 miles east, Green Haven Correctional Facility in New York runs on its own heavy rhythm. It's another maximum security world. Old walls, long hallways, tension that settles into corners like dust. In May 1981, the life inside Green Haven is built around routine, the same as anywhere: work details, counts, movement, waiting. Then, a correctional officer, Donna Payant, disappears inside the facility.
The disappearance is its own kind of horror in a prison. In a place designed to keep people in, it feels impossible for anyone to simply vanish. Hours stretch, the building gets searched, the ordinary becomes frantic, and then the missing becomes a death. Payant is found murdered, and the message is immediate. Even inside a controlled environment, control can fail so completely that the system can't explain itself fast enough to feel safe. The man charged is an inmate named Lemuel Smith, already serving life sentences, already someone the system doesn't expect to ever release back into daylight. The case becomes more than a crime. It becomes a blueprint for what New York will do next. Because once the state believes a person can kill a correctional officer inside a maximum security prison, the question changes. It stops being how do we manage him, and it becomes how do we build around him. Smith is placed into a special high-restriction setting, conditions so severe they trigger years of legal battles over what the state is allowed to impose. But the deeper change isn't legal, it's cultural. The idea hardens that some inmates will be treated not as prisoners serving time, but as permanent threats requiring permanent separation. And separation, once normalized, spreads. By the mid-1980s, American prisons are absorbing a new lesson. Violence doesn't just injure people, it rewrites infrastructure. It creates new categories, new labels, new housing maps. Maximum security starts to feel like an outdated phrase, because what happens when maximum isn't enough? What happens when a life sentence doesn't deter anything? What happens when the prison realizes it can't escalate punishment except by removing the human world itself? That question is why Marion's lockdown becomes legend. Not legend in the way outsiders use the word, but legend in the way institutions remember, as precedent, as proof, as permission. The system begins to chase a concept, a place designed from the ground up to prevent the kind of day Marion lived through. A place where movement is a controlled illusion, where violence can't spread because nothing spreads at all. A prison not meant to hold the many, but meant to contain the few. The names whispered in administrative meetings, the men who turned ordinary policy into a funeral. A plan starts to take shape. Not a public plan, not something advertised, a plan that looks like blueprints and budgets, like quiet approvals, like a long-term decision made behind closed doors, a facility that won't just punish the worst inmates, it will isolate them so completely they can't change the world again. And somewhere in that shifting landscape, between Marion's silence and Green Haven's shock, another era is being born. Because the truth is, the system doesn't build Supermax prisons in a single day. It builds them one violent moment at a time. And the next moment is already waiting.
California's prisons carry a different kind of weight than Marion. The buildings are older in places, sun-bleached on the outside, but the tension inside feels newer, sharper, more political, more crowded with history that never got resolved. In the early 1970s, inside San Quentin's Adjustment Center, confinement already isn't about rehabilitation, it's about removal. Men vanish into narrow cells where the air is stale and the days are built from metal sounds, slots opening, cuffs clinking, doors sealing shut like final decisions. On August 21, 1971, the Adjustment Center turns into a flashpoint the entire country will argue about for decades. George Jackson, an incarcerated activist and author with a mythic presence even behind concrete, is moved through the unit. In minutes, the place erupts into an escape attempt and a riot that leaves multiple people dead, including Jackson. The aftermath doesn't feel like a single incident, it feels like a doorway opening into a new era, one where prison administrators no longer believe a traditional maximum security facility can contain its own worst days. In the gravity field of that event, names orbit and collide. One of them is Hugo Pinell, already known inside the system as a man who does not de-escalate, does not soften, does not drift into the background. Before San Quentin, Pinell has already been convicted of violent crimes, and while incarcerated, he has been tied to a killing at Soledad in March 1971, when a correctional officer named Robert McCarthy is lured to a cell and fatally attacked. Pinell is moved through institutions like a storm system. Wherever he goes, the air pressure changes.
After San Quentin's 1971 chaos, he becomes part of a larger narrative, charged alongside others in what becomes known as the San Quentin 6 case, a trial that drags on long enough to become its own kind of punishment. But the real punishment for Payant is quieter and longer. Time doesn't simply pass for him, it hardens. Decade after decade, he lives in isolation so continuous it becomes his biography. The cell becomes a universe, the routine becomes a form of erosion. Strip away movement, strip away contact, strip away the casual humanity of being near other humans. The system's message is blunt. Some people will be managed by subtraction. If the state cannot safely house you among others, then you will be housed away from everything that makes among others possible. And the longer the isolation lasts, the more it teaches the institution something dangerous. It can do this indefinitely. Back in the federal system, the lesson from Marion keeps spreading. The word control unit stops sounding like a temporary measure and starts sounding like a philosophy. Administrators across the country begin building policies around a single obsession, preventing the next day that forces them to admit they lost. The result is a new kind of prison design, one aimed not at containing a population, but at containing risk. By the early 1990s, that design becomes a destination, ADX Florence in Colorado, the ADX Supermax concept made physical. It's built for the people the system considers too dangerous to live like ordinary prisoners. The building is engineered around separation, cells designed to keep men alone, movement designed to happen without contact, routines designed to minimize chance. The old logic of prison, bunks, yards, lines, noise, is replaced by something more clinical. The idea is not simply to punish, it's to eliminate unpredictability. And yet, unpredictability keeps finding cracks, because prisons aren't just architecture, they're ecosystems. Inside them, power doesn't disappear, it reorganizes. In California, the same years Payant spends disappearing into isolation are years when prison gangs evolve from loose affiliations into structured governments. Race-based alliances harden, debts become enforceable, orders can travel farther than any one body is allowed to move. By the 2010s, California's system is loaded with pressure, overcrowding, gang politics, cycles of lockdown, and long-term segregation that has become normal enough to argue about in public. In 2013, a statewide hunger strike erupts, driven in part by men held in prolonged solitary confinement. The protests didn't need speeches to be understood. It's bodies refusing food inside institutions built to outlast refusal. The state responds in pieces, policy changes here, reviews there, but the underlying machine stays intact. Then, in January 2014, a decision is made that seems procedural on paper, but volcanic in reality. Hugo Payant is moved from deep isolation at Pelican Bay to California State Prison Sacramento, a maximum security facility near Folsom. For the system, it's paperwork, classification, transfers, housing assignments. For the people who live inside the rules, it's a signal. A man who has been separated for decades is being placed back into an environment where old rivalries and new hierarchies overlap. The prison world doesn't forget. It waits. On August 12, 2015, the day begins like most prison days begin. Routine stretched tight across too many men. The exercise yard holds bodies under open sky, but it isn't freedom, it's a controlled release valve. On that yard, Payant is attacked and killed. The violence is sudden, targeted, and instantly destabilizing. Within moments, the yard is no longer a yard, it's an ignition point. A riot erupts that officers later say involves around 70 inmates, with multiple people injured in the chaos. The response is immediate and enormous. Lockdowns, restrictions, movements stopped cold. Doors that were meant to open once a day don't open. Men are pressed back into cells and told in the language of locked steel that the institution is taking the wheel again. But the deeper consequence isn't the riot itself, it's what the riot proves. It proves that decades of isolation did not erase the danger attached to one man's name. It proves that moving a single person can reset the temperature of an entire prison. And it proves that the system's favorite tool, segregation, doesn't solve the underlying problem. It only delays the moment when the problem reappears in a different form. After the yard goes quiet, the story doesn't end, it tightens. Because Payant's death doesn't feel random. Inside prison logic, nothing that high profile ever feels random. The attack reads like a message delivered at knife-edge timing, the kind of act that makes everyone ask the same question without speaking it. Who decided this, and how far did the decision travel before it reached the yard? And that's where the modern prison era reveals its most unsettling evolution. In the decades since Marion, control has expanded beyond walls and doors. Control now includes networks, alliances, rank, discipline, and communication methods that survive lockdowns. Even in systems built to isolate the worst of the worst, influence can still move. The body is contained, but the order can travel. By the time the yard is cleaned and the gates settle back into routine, one reality hangs over the facility like smoke that won't clear. Payant was not just killed, he was chosen. And somewhere inside the same system that promised total control, inside the sealed schedules, the classifications, the silent corridors, there are signs that the decision didn't start on that yard at all. It started earlier. It started quietly. And in the next chapter, the story follows the trail of power that doesn't need open doors to move, because the most dangerous inmates don't always change prison policy with their hands. Sometimes they change it with a message that gets through anyway.
After the yard goes quiet in Sacramento, the prison doesn't return to normal. It returns to procedure, the kind that drains color from everything. Doors stop cycling the way they used to. Movement becomes rarer, tighter, more conditional. The air inside the housing units changes, like an entire building holding its breath. The men feel it first, not through announcements, but through the small punishments of uncertainty. A meal arriving later than usual, a recreation window that never comes, a tear that stays sealed longer than anyone expects. In this world, violence doesn't only take lives, it creates policy. Hugo Payant's death becomes a kind of warning label printed onto the system's future, not because he was the only man capable of destabilizing a prison, but because his name proved how long a prison can remember and how fast it can panic when history returns. Payant had spent decades in near-total isolation, and still, in the moment he was placed back into an open environment, the ecosystem reacted like it had been waiting for him. The lesson is immediate. A body can be contained for decades and still arrive with consequences. That same logic is what Marion taught the federal system in 1983. At USP Marion, the 2 killings in a single day didn't just create grief, they created a blueprint. The institution didn't ask how to make prisons safer in a human way. It asked how to make safety mechanical, a permanent lockdown, a control unit model, a future where the solution to unpredictability was to remove the possibility of human contact altogether. And once that logic exists, it doesn't stay in one place, it spreads. It becomes a template other prisons can copy when fear outruns creativity. That's how the Supermax era becomes inevitable. In the years that follow Marion, the federal system builds toward a destination that looks like an answer: ADX Florence, an environment engineered to reduce interaction to almost nothing. The concept seems simple. If violence erupts during movement, then reduce movement. If influence spreads through contact, then reduce contact. If certain inmates cannot be managed, then place them somewhere built to manage the concept of unmanageable. But prisons aren't only built from doors and concrete. They're built from people adapting. Even under extreme restriction, status still forms, reputation still matters. The inside world still organizes itself around fear and loyalty, around debts and protection, around who can reach who, even if reach means time, pattern, and a message carried on the smallest opportunity. The system can tighten its grip, but it can't erase human behavior. It can only reshape it. That's the most haunting part of this story. Every time the prison system expands solitary confinement, Every time it builds a new control unit, every time it invents a harsher category, it's reacting not to a single act, but to the reality that control is never finished. It has to be performed forever. In New York, the killing of Officer Donna Payant at Green Haven did something similar. It turned one crime into a long argument about separation, about how far a state could go to isolate one man, Lemuel Smith, and what it meant for every other person the system would later decide was too risky. Once the justification exists for extreme restriction, it becomes easier to apply it again. A special unit becomes a policy becomes a routine, and a routine becomes a culture. Which is why the fifth name in this story still matters, even decades later. George Jackson's death at San Quentin in 1971 wasn't just a tragedy inside a prison, it became a symbol of ideology, of rebellion, of fear on both sides of the bars. The event didn't need to be repeated to leave a permanent scar. It helped convince prison systems that certain inmates weren't simply criminals serving time. They were forces capable of igniting institutions. And when prison systems begin treating people like forces, the answer becomes structural. Control units, segregation wings, isolation regimes that grow year after year until they're no longer special, they're standard. Now the camera pulls back, beyond single yards and single tiers, to the larger machine. The modern prison system starts to speak a new language: classification, restrictive housing, validated associations, security threat groups. Terms designed to sound neutral, technical, clinical, words that turn human beings into categories and categories into placement decisions that can last years. The people inside don't need to hear the policy language to feel it. They can feel it in the walls that don't open, the hours that don't change, the way the future becomes a hallway that leads only to more hallway. And then comes the twist that makes this episode darker than it first appears. Because the 5 men in this story did not only change prison policy by what they did in the moment, they changed it by proving something administrators never want to admit out loud. The system isn't reacting to violence, it's reacting to the possibility of embarrassment. Marion wasn't just a tragedy, it was a public admission that a high-security prison could be breached from within. Green Haven wasn't just a murder, it was the horrifying fact that someone tasked with control could vanish inside the very place built for control. San Quentin wasn't just a riot, it was a demonstration that an institution could be made to look powerless. And in Sacramento, Pinnell's death wasn't just a killing, it was a reminder that decades of isolation can fail in a single afternoon. So the system keeps building harsher solutions, not only to prevent harm, but also to prevent the moment the world sees the prison lose. That's how solitary confinement expands. That's how Supermax logic survives. That's how the control unit becomes the answer before the question is even finished. By the end of the 2010s and into the 2020s, the consequences appear everywhere. Long-term segregation debated in public, reforms promised, policies adjusted, then tightened again after the next crisis. The system oscillates between two instincts, containment and correction, but whenever fear spikes, containment wins. It wins because it's immediate. It wins because it's measurable. It wins because it's easier to lock a door than to untangle the ecosystem that makes violence inevitable. And the men inside are left with a final reality. The deadliest inmates don't only end lives, they end assumptions. They end the assumption that a prison can be secure in the human sense. They end the assumption that punishment alone creates deterrence. They end the assumption that isolation is temporary, and they end the assumption that worst of the worst is a small category that will never grow. Because once a system builds an entire architecture around fear, fear starts demanding more space. The episode closes the way it began, in a corridor, in a routine, in a world built on repeating days. Somewhere, another prison wakes up, keys jingle, doors cycle, men stand for count,
A few seconds of movement opens like a crack in a wall, and the system, haunted by Marion, by Green Haven, by San Quentin, by Sacramento, watches that crack like it's the only thing that matters. Not because it expects another name to become legend, because it knows one eventually will. And when that day comes, the prison system will do what it has always done after the worst moments. It will build another answer out of concrete, steel, and silence, then call it safety. If that chilled you, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe, because the next story doesn't start with a crime, it starts with a door that should never open, opening anyway.